It is a little after 5 in the evening on April 16, 1960, and Irene Garza is standing in front of her bedroom mirror, pinning her hair the way she always does before church. Her mother can hear her humming through the wall. On the dresser sits a small stack of graded spelling tests from her second-grade class at Thigpen Elementary, the red pen still uncapped beside them. She will finish grading them tomorrow. Tonight is Holy Saturday, the day before Easter, and Irene has one thing left to do before the holiday can truly begin: confession. She smooths her lavender blouse, checks her lipstick one more time, picks up her white patent leather purse, and calls out to her mother that she will be home soon. She will never say another word to her again. Before we go any further, if you're new to this channel, we dig into a new cold case every single week, the ones that never got the attention they deserved the first time around. Hit subscribe now so you don't lose this one in your feed, because where this story goes next is going to make you angrier than almost anything we've covered. Irene Garza was 25 years old, a schoolteacher, a former beauty queen, and by every account, the kind of daughter a small South Texas town points to with pride. She had been crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart in 1958, and in the years since she had settled into something quieter and, to her, more meaningful, a classroom full of 7-year-olds who adored her, a close Catholic family, a fiancé she was planning a future with. Her students would remember her for years afterward, not because of the crown or the sash, but because of the way she made a room full of second graders feel like the most important people in the building. That was the legacy Irene was quietly building, one spelling test and one Sunday Mass at a time, long before anyone outside her family would know her name from a headline. McAllen, Texas in 1960 was a tight, church-centered community, small enough that a person's reputation traveled faster than the roads connecting one side of town to the other. Sacred Heart Catholic Church sat near the center of that world, the kind of institution nobody would have thought to question. Priests were trusted by default. Confession was sacred, private, untouchable. Nobody in 1960 McAllen would have imagined that trust being weaponized. She drove to Sacred Heart that evening, the church her family had attended for years, to make her confession before Easter Mass the next morning. She parked her car near the church. She was seen going inside. And then, sometime in the hours that followed, Irene Garza simply stopped existing to the outside world. When she didn't come home that night, her family assumed she'd been delayed, maybe stopped to visit a friend, maybe lost track of time. But as the hours slipped past midnight, that explanation stopped making sense. Irene was not the kind of young woman who disappeared without a word. By sunrise on Easter Sunday, her father was standing in front of a McAllen police officer, filing a missing persons report, while the rest of the town got ready for church, as if nothing at all was wrong. What followed was the largest volunteer search the Rio Grande Valley had organized to that point. Neighbors, students' parents, off-duty deputies, strangers who only knew Irene's name from the newspaper. They combed fields, canals, and roadsides for 5 straight days. Parents of her own second graders walked the search lines, some bringing their own children, unable to explain why their teacher hadn't shown up to grade their Easter homework. For 5 days, McAllen functioned less like a town and more like a single family holding its breath. Then her belongings started turning up, in places that made no sense. A single high-heeled shoe, abandoned near an empty road, lying on its side as if it had fallen from a moving vehicle. Her purse, discovered in the middle of an open field, patent leather glinting against the dirt. These weren't the kind of details that pointed toward a young woman who had wandered off. They pointed toward someone else's hands moving her and her belongings through the dark. On April 21st, 5 days after she vanished, searchers found her. Irene Garza's body was floating face down in an irrigation canal near what is now Business 83 and 2nd Street, a location so central that searchers had unknowingly passed within feet of her for days. She was still fully dressed, except for her shoes and her underwear. Her lavender blouse, the one she'd smoothed in the mirror 5 days earlier, had been unbuttoned. The autopsy confirmed what the town had feared. Irene had been beaten with a hard object, sexually assaulted while unconscious, and suffocated. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Whoever did this had taken time, made choices, one after another, then driven her body across town to a canal and let the water do the rest of the work of hiding what they'd done. Investigators zeroed in on a name that would follow this case for the next 56 years, Father John Fite. Fite was 27, a Catholic priest recently assigned to Sacred Heart, the very church Irene had gone to that night. He told police he'd heard her confession, but not in the confessional booth, where a wall should have separated them. He said it happened in the church rectory instead, private, no grill, no witnesses. It was Fite himself who placed her there, alone with him. He denied killing her, but almost immediately, one detail made him impossible to ignore. Less than a month before Irene disappeared, on March 23, 1960, Fite had already been accused of attacking a young woman inside a church. Her name was Mara Guerra. She was 20. The attack bore an unsettling resemblance to what would happen to Irene weeks later. Fite pleaded no contest and paid a $500 fine for aggravated assault, a quiet resolution that, in hindsight, looks less like a lapse in judgment and more like a rehearsal. Investigators had all of this sitting in their own files, and they still could not, or would not, make it stick. Here's where the story of Irene Garza stops being only about a murder and starts being about an institution protecting one of its own. Investigators did recover physical evidence. An Eastman Codaslide viewer, later traced back to Fite, placing him closer to Irene than his own account allowed for, a prime suspect, a near-identical prior assault, physical evidence. The case still stalled. And then it went quiet. One of the original investigators, McAllen officer Milo Ponce, was pulled off the case by his own superiors, reasons never fully explained. His daughter, Noemi Ponce Sigler, would later describe finding her father deeply upset that day. He never fully recovered from it. For the rest of his life, he carried the weight of a case he believed he could have solved. For over 40 years, nothing happened. The prime suspect walked away, left the priesthood in the late 1960s, married, moved to Arizona, and built a new life as a husband, father, and eventually a grandfather. Meanwhile, Irene's parents grew old in South Texas, never seeing an arrest, still fielding the same question every Easter. Did anyone ever pay for what happened to Irene? Honestly, if you were this family, waiting decades for answers like this, do you think you'd have kept fighting, or would you have eventually let it go? Let us know down below. Now let's talk about what almost changed everything, and why it still took over a decade to get anywhere close to justice. In 1963, Fite was sent to a monastery in Missouri for what was called a period of spiritual reflection. There, he met a monk named Dale Tichenny. According to Tichenny, Fite confessed to him directly that he had killed Irene Garza. Not a rumor, a direct confession, from the suspect himself to a man of faith with no reason to invent it. For nearly 40 years, that confession sat unspoken. It wasn't until 2002 that Tichenny, along with Fite's former friend Reverend Joseph O'Brien, who had heard his own version of Fite's admissions, finally came forward. Whatever kept them silent for 4 decades, something had shifted enough for both to put Fite's own words on the record. McAllen Police Chief Victor Rodriguez reopened the investigation, bringing in the newly formed Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit. For the Garza family, it was the first real institutional momentum in over 4 decades. This is where the case should have finally broken open. It didn't. The file landed on the desk of District Attorney Irene Garza, who had held the office for 32 years. Asked by reporters in 2002 whether the case could realistically be prosecuted, Guerra said solving it was about as likely as pigs learning to fly. Under pressure, he did bring the case before a grand jury in 2004, but none of the 3 men whose testimony mattered most were called. Not Tichenny, not O'Brien, not Fite himself. A grand jury was asked to weigh a 44-year-old murder without hearing from the very witnesses who had reopened the case in the first place. The grand jury declined to indict. Irene's cousin, Linda De La Vigna, later described running into Guerra at the courthouse, where he told her she would never get an indictment in this case, a moment she never forgot. For all of Guerra's certainty, the case did not die there. The break finally came under a new district attorney, Ricardo Rodriguez, who took a different view of the evidence. In February 2016, police arrested John Fite, now 83, using a walker, living quietly in Scottsdale, Arizona. He appeared in a Phoenix courtroom the next day, disoriented by how far the past had reached to find him. This whole thing makes no sense to me, because the crime in question took place in 1960, he reportedly told the court. He was held on $750,000 bail while he fought extradition. Rodriguez put it plainly to reporters. This arrest was the first real step toward justice for Irene Garza, after nearly 56 years of waiting. It's worth pausing on something that happened years earlier, in 2007, when CNN correspondent Gary Tuchman tracked Fite down and asked him directly, on camera, "Did you commit the murder of Irene Garza?" Fite didn't deny it. He said, "Interesting question." Fite's trial finally began in November 2017, more than 57 years after Irene went missing. For a family that had chased this moment for decades, watching him sit at a defense table as an old man in a modern courtroom must have felt surreal. Prosecutors walked jurors through the CODA slide viewer tying him to the scene, his own conflicting 1960 statements about where he'd heard Irene's confession and why. The confession he'd allegedly made to Tacheni at that Missouri monastery, testimony that, unlike in the failed 2004 grand jury, finally reached the people deciding his fate. And the pattern established by the Maraguera assault, weeks before Irene's murder. The defense argued what defenses in 57-year-old cases almost always argue. Memories fade, evidence degrades. A man in his 80s shouldn't answer for accusations this old. The jury did not agree. On December 7, 2017, a jury convicted John Fite of murder with malice. He was sentenced to life in prison. He died in custody several years later, an old man who had spent more of his life free than Irene Garza had spent alive at all. So Fite was convicted. Case closed, right? Not quite, because a conviction, 57 years after the fact, doesn't answer the question that has haunted this case since 1960. How many people knew and chose to protect him instead of her? A priest assaults a young woman in a church weeks before a second young woman is murdered after visiting him for confession, and it results in a $500 fine and no further scrutiny. Physical evidence links him to the victim, and the case still stalls. A dedicated investigator gets pulled off the case for reasons never explained. Two men hold a direct confession of guilt for nearly 40 years. A sitting district attorney publicly mocks the idea the case could be solved, then structures a grand jury to exclude the three witnesses who mattered most. None of that happens by accident. Milo Ponce died without ever learning who pulled him off the case, or why. Rene Guerra was never held accountable for how he handled it. He continued serving as district attorney for years afterward. What the Catholic diocese knew, and when, has never been fully unsealed to the public. Tacheni and O'Brien were never asked to explain, publicly, why it took them 40 years to speak. Irene Garza got her killer's name attached to a life sentence, 57 years after he took everything from her. The institutions that shielded him for 56 of those years walked away with their names barely mentioned in the same breath as his. Irene Garza was 25 years old. She taught 7-year-olds how to read. She'd been crowned a beauty queen 2 years before her death, and she was days away from an Easter Sunday she never got to see. She went to confession, the most private, most trusting act a Catholic can perform, and the person she trusted with that moment took her life. Think about that timeline for a moment. Irene was murdered in 1960, before the moon landing, before the Civil Rights Act. The man responsible lived an entire second life in the time it took the system to catch up to him, long enough to become a grandfather, long enough that the courtroom he finally stood in would have looked like science fiction to the man who walked out of that rectory in April 1960. Somewhere in McAllen, Texas, there's still a canal near 2nd Street where none of this ever really ended for the people who lived through it. Longtime residents still know exactly which stretch of water it is. Irene never got to grade those last spelling tests sitting on her dresser. She never got to marry the man she was engaged to. She never got to stand in front of another classroom of 7-year-olds and watch them learn to read a full sentence on their own. All of it was taken from her in a few hours, on a Saturday evening in April, by someone the entire town had been raised to trust completely, simply because of the collar he wore. If this case stayed with you the way it stayed with us, subscribe and turn on notifications. We publish a new one just like it every single week, including a Texas case next time that still doesn't have an ending. Drop a comment and let us know what stuck with you most about Irene's story. We read all of them, and we'll see you in the next one.